Welcome, everyone. It's great to have everyone here for a first class as part of Sphere Zman. This is the Covenant at Mount Sinai, a model for conversion in rabbinic thought with Rabbi Dan Margulies. So, what is going on in the cryptic covenant ceremony in Exodus chapter 24? How did the rabbis actively model the halakhic structure of formal conversion to Judaism off the covenant at Mount Sinai? How did they ensure that it would be able to continue even after the destruction of the temple and the loss of sacrifices? What does any of this have to do with the arcane laws of the red heifer? We'll explore these questions and more across 3 text-intensive sessions focused on Exodus chapter 24 with commentaries, Talmud Bavli Keritot, Daf 9, and select passages from the commentary of the Tosafot across the Talmud. It's really a pleasure to be learning with Rabbi Margulies again at Drisha. He's taught here before. He is a teacher of Tanakh, Talmud, and Halacha at the Berman Hebrew Academy in Rockville, Maryland, and he has taught at our summer kollel. He is a musmach of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and from Dayan Simcha Kraus, Zichrono Livracha, and as well as learned previously in the kollel at YU and REITs. Previously, he was a congregational rabbi in the New York area, and now he's a resident of DC. And his sources for today's class will be posted in chat momentarily. And with that, I'd like to hand things over.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kayla. And it's such a pleasure that all of you are here. It's such a pleasure to be teaching and learning together. Drisha fosters and enables so many incredible learning opportunities. Like Kayla said, I've taught in the high school program. I've taught in the summer kollel. I'll be teaching the summer kollel again this summer. And it's my first time teaching during the school year at Drisha in one of the evening courses. So it's really a great pleasure. And I'm so excited to be doing this. This is a topic that, on the one hand, maybe some of it is something that you may have explored before, whether in a Parsha class, in exploration of some of these halachic topics. And some of this is really original ideas that I've started putting together over the past few years that hopefully we'll be working toward, especially coming up in the final of the 3 classes. And so it'll be hopefully things that you have your own insights to and that you can contribute and share, and also a chance to explore something new, which I'm still workshopping. So I'm, of course, open to receiving feedback and your own insights to help construct some of the concepts that we're exploring. As Kayla said, the main topic and the topic of interest is really the question of conversion. And in particular, how did the rabbis of the Talmud, the Talmudic period, Mishnaic period, let's say around 1800, 1900 years ago, think about what it meant to become Jewish. That is, to actively choose to join the Jewish community and to be accepted as a Jew by the existing Jewish community. And in particular, thinking about what were the models that they were drawing upon in the Torah text as a halachic basis for that. Because as scholars of Tanakh, as students of Tanakh, we may have noticed there doesn't seem to be such a strict or formal process of being welcomed into the Israelite nation, to the Jewish people, in the stories of Tanakh. When Abraham is asked by Sarah to cohabit with her concubine Hagar in order to have a son Ishmael, we don't hear anything about how Hagar became, so to speak, Jewish. When Moshe marries Tzipporah, the daughter of Yitro, and has his children with her, and they are happily married for however long, and et cetera, we don't hear anything about how a Midianite woman joins the Israelite nation. When we explore various passages in the Nevi'im, where various characters, various kings and other people end up marrying either women from non-Jewish nations, or Jewish women end up being married to men from non-Jewish nations, we don't know. Was there some process involved? And so obviously the historical question is one question, but by the time we get to the rabbinic period, and the rabbis do have a concept of formal acceptance, whether you could think of that as naturalized citizenship, right? That is someone who is being accepted into a national group by the existing community, and they have to establish their bona fides, and they have to ground themselves as member of that community. Then the question is, well, what is that formal process going to look like? And obviously, the way the halacha has ended up now will be something that we'll talk about as this goes on as well. But what are the precedents in Tanakh, in the biblical sources that the rabbis drew upon? And we're going to explore as well, what were some potential ingredients to this process that ended up getting ignored or ended up getting excluded from the halakhic bottom line, that maybe have some interesting or compelling ideas behind them, even if they're not so practical nowadays. So basically the structure of the 3 courses that we're going to see this week, next week, and the week after is this week we're going to focus primarily on Shemot Perek Kafdal at Exodus chapter 24, which is as titled, and as you can see on the document, the covenant ceremony. That's sort of how it's known in some of the academic sources and things like that. So there's Exodus chapter 24, which we'll explore and discuss. Obviously, in the time of Sfirat HaOmer, where we're in now, and we're preparing for Shavuot, it's fascinating and important to consider what happened at Har Sinai, what happened at Mount Sinai when the Jewish people stood there and received the Torah, and what were all the various components. Of course, spilling the beans here a little bit, it's interesting that that becomes the episode that the rabbis are going to draw upon a lot. We could have thought of other precedents, right? What about the story of Ruth? What about other examples where, and they do draw upon the story of Ruth as an archetype of conversion as well. But the Mount Sinai moment, and a particular piece of it, is what the rabbis really pick up on as the central focus for this conversion conversation. Next week, we'll see how the rabbis develop that in the Talmudic Sugya. And then the third week, we'll explore in particular the missing detail that is suggested by some of the Tosafot in various places. And that's going to get a little bit more arcane and a little bit more original ideas from yours truly based off of those sources. So we'll see where we get with that and whether we can come to some interesting ideas there. But this week, we're going to look closely at Exodus chapter 24. So hopefully, if you have the sheet in front of you, it should be 3 pages. The sources are there with English. I put in some footnotes. The footnotes are mine. The translations are mine. If you find mistakes in the translation, it's because I was doing it myself. So obviously, you can disagree on any of the details there, or if you have questions about that. But let's take a look briefly here. The first thing we have, source number Aleph, is from the book of Shemot. And this is already part of the question with the end of the book of Shemot, or middle to end of book of Shemot, is the question of the chronology. Maybe some people have studied this part of the book of Shemot before. There's a whole question here because Rashi assumes that the structure of these episodes, basically from Exodus chapter 18 until, let's call it what, chapter 34, 18 through 34 of the book of Exodus, Rashi, based off of midrashic precedents, basically asserts that many of these narratives are being told completely out of chronological order. And even verses which are adjacent to each other may be describing events that took place not so close to each other in time. Ramban is very upset with Rashi for this thesis, and Ramban advocates very strongly for reading this whole section from chapter 18 to chapter 34 chronologically. So Rashi is the one who quotes maybe a hopefully famous phrase, Ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. There's no determinate what happened first and what happens after the strict chronology of the biblical narrative. And Ramban is the one who claims to the contrary, that we should say yesh mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. The Torah is told in a clear chronological order. So let's take a look at Shemot chapter 24. Vayavo Moshe. Moshe came. So apparently this is being told, this is from the end of our Parashat Mishpatim. Our Parashat Mishpatim starts with chapter 21. So now after the selection, the code of laws that appears throughout most of Parashat Mishpatim, then apparently Moshe comes down from the mountain after having that revelation from God and tells them to the people. And the people hearing all of those laws, Vaya'an kol ha'am kol echad, the whole nation responds in one voice, Vayomeru, the famous verse, they say, Kol ha'devarim asher dibar Adonai na'aseh v'nishma, right? We will do and we will listen. Oh, wait, no, that's not what it says. This is just na'aseh. We will do what God has commanded. Na'aseh v'nishma is going to come later. Okay. So first, Moshe reports to the people the laws that God has commanded, and the people say, we're going to follow it. Fine. Then, after revealing it to them orally, verbally, Vayichtov Moshe et kol divrei Adonai. Then Moshe writes it down. Vayashkem baboker. The next day, the next morning, apparently, if we're reading it chronologically, he wakes up in the morning. And what does Moshe do in the morning? Vayiven mizbeach tachat hahar. He builds an altar, as I translated here, at the foot of the mountain. This becomes a topic of much midrashic exploration as well. We'll leave it with that for now. Ushtei mesrei matzeva, and 12 pillars, 12 monuments. Okay, there's a footnote about that as well. Fine. Lishnei masar shivtei Yisrael. So he's building some kind of a communal altar here both with an altar, a mizbeach, which is generally understood to be a collection of stones that are constructed in a horizontal structure to be used for sacrifice of animals, as well as 12 matzevot. And a matzeva is usually a single stone that's vertical and is used for libation of wine or oil, some other liquid sacrifice. Okay, we could, if we were having another class now, we could describe and explore some of the symbolism involved in that as well, but not for now. Any questions so far? Okay, the third verse, that's the verse number 5. Vayishlach et na'arei b'nei Yisrael. Moshe sent the young men, the youths of Bnei Israel. I don't know exactly how young, and I don't know exactly where he sent them, but okay. Vaya'alu olot, and they offered burnt offerings. Vayizbechu zivachim shelamim la'Adonai parim, and they slaughtered and offered peace offerings, barbecue sacrifice to God, which were of bulls. Okay, the whole question here today I saw from Rabbi Mordechai Breuer about how to parse this pasuk based off of the trope. A little bit too technical for us right now. Okay, so they offer a sacrifice. Moses builds the altar, and then these young men, why the young men and not the older men? Why young men and not women, etc.? Okay, fine. But why did they offer these offerings? 2 different types of offerings, burnt offerings and peace offerings. Who can volunteer for me to read my footnote number 3?
An olah is a, quote, burnt offering, which is fully consumed in the sacrificial fire on the altar and is not eaten. It usually symbolizes a feeling of gratitude and dedication to God. Most communal sacrifices are olot.
Okay, so that's what we would expect of a communal sacrifice. The people are gathered at Har Sinai, they're receiving the Torah, they're making a formal, establishing some moment of we're accepting the Torah, they're offering these sacrifices, so they bring a korban olah, or many olot. Okay, and what about footnote number 4, the zevach shlamim?
All right, the zevach shlamim. A zevach shlamim is a quote peace offering, of which some of the blood and fats are burned in the sacrificial fire on the altar, and the remainder of the meat is shared among the priests and the owners. It usually symbolizes feelings of celebration and thanksgiving. Notably, the zevach shlamim is usually offered by an individual, and only once a year, on Shavuot, is offered by the community.
Okay, so this is what's interesting to me already, which is, if we pause and think, right, many people maybe have noted at various shiurim and talked about how in the Torah, it's not explicit that Shavuot is a commemoration and celebration of the anniversary of the giving of the Torah. To us, it seems obvious, right? We're told that since kindergarten, if we went to a Jewish kindergarten or whatever, or we see all the symbolism of Shavuot, right? We see all the decorations. It's all about the 10 Commandments and Har Sinai and the flowers on Har Sinai and all of these things. And in the Torah, we know why we celebrate Pesach. It says to remember the season of leaving Egypt. And we know why we celebrate Sukkot, because we're supposed to commemorate living in huts. Why Sukkot is in the fall is a discussion among many of the Mefarshim as well. Okay. And Shavuot, it says it's 50 days after Pesach. And when you do the math in the Torah, it certainly seems that Shavuot, the giving of the Torah, takes place early on in the month of Sivan, 2-ish months, less than 2 months after leaving Egypt. But it doesn't say explicitly that it's to commemorate the giving of the Torah. So one of the only hints in the Torah that Shavuot is actually about the giving of the Torah is that the same type of sacrifice which took place when they received the Torah, a communal zevach shlamim, repeats itself every year, once a year only, on Shavuot. There are other places on exceptional circumstances, maybe where there is a communal zevach shlamim, but that's the only time in the regular seasonal calendar of sacrifices when that's given. Okay, so they offer these sacrifices. Fine. Vaikach Moshe, this is where it's going to get weird. Warning. Okay? So, Vaikach Moshe chatzi hadam. Moshe takes half the blood. Vayasem ba'aganot, and he puts it in basins or baskets of some sort. Okay? I translated basins because usually a woven basket is probably not very watertight. Depends on how good of a weaver you are. V'chatzi hadam zarak al hamizbeach, and half of the blood he put on the altar. Now, usually with a sacrifice, what do you do with the sacrificial blood? Usually you put it on the altar, because that's how you show that you're dedicating it to God, especially if it's a sacrifice where most of the meat is not going to be burned on the altar. The meat will be eaten by the owner of the sacrifice. The blood goes on the altar to dedicate to God. That's sort of the central sacrificial act. Okay? So fine, he put half the blood on the altar. and other half was in a basin. Vayikach Sefer Habrit. He took the scroll of the covenant. What was the scroll of the covenant? So basically, most of the Mefarshim say, well, didn't you pay attention? Back in Pasuk Dalet, it says that Moshe wrote down all of the laws that God had commanded. So if Moshe wrote down all of the laws, he must have written it on a scroll. So this is the scroll that he wrote down. Okay, according to some of the Mefarshim, this is actually the prototype of the whole Sefer Torah. That is, it goes all the way from Bereshit until the laws of Mishpatim. Others of the Mefarshim would say that it only includes the laws of Mishpatim, but not the narratives of Bereshit through the Exodus. An interesting topic for another time. Vayikach Sefer Habrit, Vayikra be'ozneham, and now he reads it to them. Didn't he report it to them orally yesterday? So yesterday, he comes down from the mountain and tells them the laws, and then wrote it down, goes to sleep, wakes up in the morning, builds an altar, they bring all the sacrifices, and now he takes the book that he wrote down and he reads it to them again. So they get it twice. Once totally oral and once being read from a written text. Oh, that's like the two kinds of Torah we have. Oral recitation from memory, Torah shebe'al peh, and reading from a written text, Torah shebichtav, studying a written text. Fine, okay. So Matan Torah had both also. And what do the people say? Vayomeru, the people say, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma. Everything that God has spoken, everything that Hashem has spoken, we will do, and we will listen. Of course, all of the beautiful divrei Torah that you could say about why they put do in front of listen, or what does listen mean? Does listen mean observe? Does it mean obey? We could talk about also if we're talking about the Shema that we say, right? When we say Shema Yisrael, does it just mean to hear it with your ear? Does it mean hear? Does it mean listen? Does it mean observe? Does it mean obey? Does it mean comprehend? Right? There's a whole range of meanings. Okay. Then what does Moshe do? He takes the blood. Vayikach Moshe hadam. Well, which blood does he take? Well, half of it is already on the altar. So he has to take the one that he put in the basket, in the basins that he stored, put aside earlier. Right? He takes the blood that was in the basins already. Vayizrok al ha'am. And he threw it on the people. Okay. And this before running water, guys. Vayomer, we're turning on to the top of page 2. Vayomer hine dam habirit. This, behold, this is the blood of the covenant. Asher karat Adonai machem, that God is sealing with you. Al kol hadivarim ha'il, concerning all of these words. Okay, straightforward enough, right? What happens? Someone wants to explain? Any volunteers? You want to hear my theory? I mean, I want to hear from you all. No? What's going on? Why does he sprinkle them with blood? Sounds messy.
Blood changes the status of things.
Okay, blood is powerful magic. Blood is mojo in the Torah, right? If something is going to happen, we talk about spilling blood, shedding blood. We talk about, blood brothers. We talk about, right?
I mean, also something that, hasn't come up chronologically in the sources you're looking at, but blood purifies things or inaugurates things, like the inauguration of the Kohanim.
Oh, very good, Kayla, right? So when the Kohanim are appointed Kohanim, this was in Parashat Tzav as well as in Parashat Tetzaveh, the Kohanim get blood on their ear ridge and on the thumb and on the big toe, and that's part of the process which purifies and inaugurates them as Kohanim. Also, the Mizbeach, of course, the altar itself, is regularly sprinkled with blood. So a human being getting sprinkled with blood is, in a sense, a conduit of sacrificial and cultic service in that regard. Any other thoughts? Martha, it looked like you had a thought that you wanted to say. So if you unmute yourself.
We already have the model with Abraham way back in, that splitting the birds in blood. So that's.
Oh, we'll get to that. So splitting things in half for sure.
Model. Yeah,
exactly. With the story of Abraham, for people not as familiar as Martha, when Abraham makes his first covenant with God, this is not the covenant of circumcision, but it's the covenant what's called Brit Bein Habitarim, the covenant between the severed parts. In Genesis chapter 15, Abraham is told to split the sacrificial animals in half, and then he has to walk between, or the fire, which is somehow representative of God's presence, passes between the animals, and that's somehow, so we'll get to that soon, because it can be referenced in some of the sources we'll see in a bit. Okay, very good, Martha. I know we have to sort of rush through some of this, but no, we're unpacking all of this. All the Mefarshim on here also, you can like study some of it on your own as well. Also blood, right? Circumcision is marked with, of course, with blood. There's even a halakhic question that comes about in the 20th century with some of the surgical developments that came about around new medical technologies, where from the doctor's perspective, maybe hemostasis, that is preventing bleeding on infants during circumcision, was seen as a medical advantage. But then from the halakhic perspective, certain rabbis opposed that because they said, how can you have the brit of Milah, the covenant that's sealed through circumcision, without drawing blood? Blood is a potent symbol as part of the circumcision process. Also, of course, menstruation and menstrual blood, the blood of childbirth. There are many other moments in human life and patterns of normal behavior, and which are potent religious moments and religious symbols, which of course are associated with blood. Sacrificing an animal or just slaughtering an animal to eat, of course, the blood carries the life force, the life energy of the animal in a way that's obviously very symbolic and very evocative. So thinking about what is Moshe doing with the blood here is going to be part of our big question. So if you look at footnote number 6, it says here, the footnote number 6 I wrote, as is debated below, so we're about to see some of the sources right now. It's a major question for us if the preposition al, vaizrok al ha'am, here is to be read as on the people or on behalf of, okay? On certainly sounds much more literal and is very embodied, right? Moshe literally takes a basin of blood from however many animals and sprinkles it on the people. And there are 1 million people, 2 million people standing there in front of him. I don't know exactly whether he literally got everybody, but he sprinkles the blood in their direction, or it really does go on them. And the blood landing on your body is somehow a mark of the covenant. Okay, that's one possibility. He says, Hinei dam habrit. Others of the Mefarshim are much less comfortable with that literal interpretation, and they're going to say, no, it means al ha'am, on behalf of the people. If it's a sacrifice whose owners are the corporate entity of Bnei Israel, so the owners have to be responsible for it. So Moshe's action is an action that's being taken on behalf of the nation. Okay? So if you look at the Ibn Ezra, source bet, he says, Kafi da'ati shayu asrim v'arba parim. He says he thinks there must have been 24 bulls, 12 as olot and 12 as shulamim. Okay? So it has to work out. So if you think about actually how much blood is in a bull cow, it's a lot of blood, right? I don't know if anybody ever seen a video of shechita here. Maybe if you're vegetarian, certainly I wouldn't recommend it. Well, of course, it would only just make you want to not eat meat even more. If you're a meat eater, it might make you sick to your stomach a little bit to see, but okay, it's an interesting question. But let's take a look at the Rashi. Rashi on number Gimel, okay? So Rashi says, Ba'aganot, that Moshe put the blood into the basins. Shte aganot, 2 basins. Achat lechatzidam olah. One of them was for half of the blood from the olah offerings. Echad lechatzidam shlamim, and one was for half of the blood of the shlamim offerings. Lehazototam al ha'am, to sprinkle the blood on the people. And the verb lehazot is one that comes up in many contexts, which we'll see, is the verb that we usually translate in English as to sprinkle, to when the Kohen dips his finger in the blood and sprinkles toward the parochet or toward the kaporet on Yom Kippur, this week's parasha, right? The sprinkling of the blood. Vehiza hakohen min hadam be'etzba'o. He'll sprinkle it with his finger. Or when the Kohen prepares the para aduma. Hint, hint, we're going to get to that in 2 weeks. What does the para aduma have to do with any of this? So the para aduma also involves sprinkling, not only sprinkling of the sacrificial blood when it's being slaughtered, but also sprinkling of the water, the purifying water of the para aduma on the person who's become impure in order to purify them. Okay, when the Nevi'im talk about purifying the people, Navi Yechezkel talks about purifying the people from the impurity of sin during the time of the exile. He talks about God metaphorically sprinkling the people with purifying waters, with the same word lahazot, to sprinkle, to imagine, taking some kind of, whether it's a hyssop branch like we'll do for the para aduma, and shaking the little droplets of liquid onto the recipient. And now Rashi quotes based off of a midrash, and this is something that's alluding to the Gemara we're going to see next week, We'll see 2 Gemaras next week, probably. So Rashi quotes, Mikan samechu rabotenu. Our rabbis alluded to this idea or based an idea off of this. Shenichnesu avotenu labrit. Our ancestors entered into the covenant. Okay, and I made a typo here. I wrote covenant of circumcision. I should have written covenant with circumcision. I'm sorry, with 3 steps. There are 3 ingredients by which our ancestors at Sinai entered into the brit. That is the brit of receiving the Torah. Rashi's quotes from the Gemara here in Yevamot. Librit b'milah u'tvilah v'hartzat damim. With circumcision for the men, with tvilah, immersion in the purifying waters of the mikvah, and hartzat damim. Here, I translated at advice of a colleague, a senior colleague, Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zukier, who also teaches in Drisha, and wrote his PhD thesis on the concept of ratzon in the sacrificial vocabulary of the book of Leviticus. So here, the phrase hartzat damim, that the blood is made to be ratzui, it's made to be acceptable. So here he suggested I translate it as presentation of blood. That is, the offering of the blood on the altar, or the offering of the blood as a marker on the person whom it lands on, like the Kohanim when they get purified, or like the Metzorah last week's parsha when he gets purified. The blood on the body is an embodied symbol of entering into the covenant, like circumcision, like immersion in the mikvah, where your body is cleansed in the waters of the mikvah. So hartzat damim usually would be understood as presentation of the blood on the altar. Sacrificial blood belongs on the altar. But the flip side of that is maybe it means presentation of the sacrificial blood as an embodied symbol on the person. Okay? So here you see the tension, the 2 different ways of parsing that preposition al. Is it on the people, or is it on the altar on behalf of the people? Okay? Is hartzat damim, the way we would usually understand it, sacrificial blood on the altar? Or is it perhaps an embodied symbolic blood on the person's body? Okay? She'ein haza'ah below tvila. And Rashi quotes this phrase, which we'll see hopefully in the Talmud and see the Tosafot discussing, which is, there is no case of sprinkling. Ein haza'ah. There's no sprinkling without immersion first. And we'll have to see what immersion are they talking about. And there's a strange machloket between some of the different Tosafists about this, and Rabbeinu Tam constructs a whole different paradigm. That'll be what we'll get to in 2 weeks. Okay? But right now, at least, we're seeing at least some of the ambiguity in the passage in Shemot. We see that there's a covenantal ceremony here. Moshe has come down the mountain with the laws. He's presented the laws to the people. He's written some of them down and read them to the people. There are sacrifices, and there is something going on with the sacrificial blood. Sacrificial blood, of course, an important, potent symbol. And the question is, well, where does it go? Does it go on the altar? Does it go on the people? Okay, so far, so good? Okay. When you have questions, I know it's a little bit arcane here, but I'm trying to build something cool, so you got to let me know. Okay? Arcane can be okay as long as I explain it clearly, right? Okay. So look at letter Dalet here. The Targum Onkelos very generally, in terms of the methodology of Onkelos in his Aramaic translation, very shies away from the more physical and embodied religious rituals, as well as certainly from anthropomorphic descriptions of God. So Onkelos very much tries to minimize any anthropomorphism of God and physicality associated with divine ritual. And so here, if you look, especially the part I put in bold, the Targum Onkelos translates into Aramaic, Unesev Moshe Yat Dama, Moshe took the blood, Uzirak al madbecha lechapara alama. He threw it on the altar as an atonement for the people. So that's an interpolation in his translation, not always a precise translation. Sometimes it's an interpolated explanatory translation. So here Onkelos adds in, the blood obviously went on the altar. Don't tell me they're putting blood someplace weird. But the purpose of the blood on the altar is to atone for the people. So he's very comfortable taking a more abstract conceptual idea here about the blood, that the blood is, as normal sacrificial blood, belongs on the altar, and it was put on the altar for a purpose, which was to atone for the people. Okay? Now, there are two different versions of the Rashi on that pasuk. One version of Rashi quotes the Targum the way we have it in our version of the Targum, and one quotes an abbreviated version or maybe an alternate version of the text where the Targum actually has, without the interpolation, just uzirak al ama, he threw it on the people, which seems to be what Rashi is more interested in. So, and we'll see that there's precedent for this in earlier midrash as well, but basically, do we read al as on, very embodied, very physical, Rashi, or do we read al as on behalf of, it's symbolic, it's on the altar, it's as an atonement, it's like a normal sacrifice, don't get all worked up about this wacky thing, it's not anything so unusual. Okay, turn the page, the third page, okay? And this is what Martha was hinting at before, and this is where we can build some ideas that are going to be hopefully helpful for reading Tanakh in general, and also some broader sort of questions. And I see I didn't have to rush so much. Okay. So number one, as Martha said before, the concept of a brit, the concept of a covenant is, and I'm sure Rabbi Silber has spoken about this many times among others. Rabbi Silber, I know this is a very favorite topic of his, certainly. So those who've taken his classes, of course, should continue to do so, because Rabbi Silber, of course, is the founder and major teacher in Drisha. Okay. The concept of a covenant, a brit, is important in a number of different ways, both from ancient Near Eastern historical archaeological angle, in terms of understanding the Torah, in terms of understanding the different parts of what it means to us, the Torah. And here I'm basing myself primarily on John Levinson's book, which is called Sinai in Jerusalem, where he has a very nice summary of the academic treatment of the topic of brit, that at least when he wrote the book was up to date. I suppose that was like mid-90s, so probably it's a little bit out of date now, but really the 20th century archaeological finds, there were a number of texts that were discovered in Ugarit and other places in the Middle East, which were deciphered and translated, which made clear that the patterns of text that we find in the Torah around brit are very similar in structure and in language to the formulas that appear in ancient treaties between kings and their vassals. So just a historical aside here. As a Tanakh teacher, sometimes I nerd out a little bit about the biblical archaeology side. I think my high schoolers don't like it so much because they don't know anything about history, but maybe grown-ups will have a little bit more context here. So good. So in the ancient Near East, one of the things that we see towards the end of the Bronze Age, which is right around the time the Torah is being given, of course, is there are major empires. Of course, we know about Egypt. Egypt, of course, has a major empire that flourishes and ebbs and wanes and waxes throughout the millennia. But basically, during this period, we're talking about Egypt during its Middle Kingdom period, and then Egypt during the Old Kingdom period. Not Old Kingdom, New Kingdom. I'm sorry. The New Kingdom period is really starts in the 18th and 19th dynasties, which are probably historically the best fit for describing the stories of Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's when all the classic stuff, like Ramesses and Seti and all of these figures, Tutankhamun and Amenhotep and all these other famous pharaohs. There are a lot of major battles between the Egyptians and the Hittites. The Hittites, maybe not the same Hittites as the Torah calls B'nai Chet, but maybe they're the same. Not so clear exactly. At least our early archaeologists decided to give them that name, whether they're really the same group or not. But we're a group, at least initially, centered in Anatolia, in what's now Turkey, in the Asia Minor plateau. And then they moved their way south into Syria, into the land of Israel. And in many of these larger empires, the way they secured their territory, especially in a time when travel was very slow, when sending messages was very slow, is a kind of a feudal system where there would be the main emperor. The name of the book by John Levinson is called Sinai and Jerusalem. I think I have it on my shelf in the other room, so I can't go grab it right now. I'm sorry. You Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. And I haven't finished yet, so I don't know whether to recommend it or not. All of my books are half finished. That's the problem with being somebody with ADHD. Is you start reading something, you're excited about it, then you switch topics. But okay. So in the ancient world, these major empires would establish treaties of fealty, treaties of subservience from local petty kings, local rulers. Maybe better translation for the word melech in much of the book of Yehoshua, for example, would be a mayor more than a king. Because when you actually study book of Yehoshua, you realize, well, Yehoshua defeated 31 kings in the land of Israel. Well, land of Israel, not so big. Oh, they're each a king of a city. That's what your kingdom. So a king, like I said, mayor, right? The local governance of a region, a small territory that could be traveled in a relatively short time. And the way it works is that the local ruler swears allegiance, swears loyalty to the overlord. So these are what are called treaties of suzerainty. That's a very fancy word. A suzerain is the overlord, the chief king, and then there's the vassal, the low king. And there are many different components of these treaties, but basically what they have is mutual pledge. There's a pledge of fealty and loyalty on the part of the petty king. There's a pledge of protection on the part of the overlord. There's some kind of agreement that's being made between them that is made in a publicly accessible document that is marked by some sort of physical symbolic marker. The treaty is deposited in a temple or a palace of some sort. The treaty is sworn to by the two parties. The treaty is also sworn to by the gods of the various parties involved, pagan deities, okay, and many other components here. So basically what the theory is that what we call a brit in the Torah, in biblical Hebrew, in many of its details is parallel to or overlaps with this concept of these suzerainty treaties. And that is that when a person or when the nation of Israel is joining into a brit with God, what they're doing is they're saying, we are a nation, you have a whole empire, you're the God of the whole universe, you're the creator of the whole universe, you're the master of every nation. We're one nation. You promise to protect us. We promise to follow your laws. We promise to show allegiance and fidelity to you. We have to swear to the terms of the agreement. We have to be bound by blessings if we uphold it and curses if we violate it. We have to mark it with some physical symbol. We have to have a covenantal meal that's shared between the two parties, etc., etc. And then when you start unpacking, you say, well, oh, covenantal meal that's shared between the parties. Well, how do you share a meal with God? You have to eat something, and God doesn't eat, right? How are we going to get around that one? Well, how do you get God to eat? You burn a sacrificial animal on the altar for God, right? You sacrifice an animal that you could have eaten and consume it in fire and let the smoke rise up to God, right? And that's, again, symbolically evocative of the idea of sharing the covenantal meal with God. And of course, then, well, what are you doing? You're saying, oh, well, that's the zevach shlamim, that's an olah. Zevach shlamim is the part that I eat, and the olah is the part that God eats, so to speak, because it's burned in fire, right? Oh, half of the blood goes on the altar, half of the, right? So you're starting to see now that all of the little components here. So Martha said, oh, when Abraham makes a covenant with God, he splits the animals in half, and the fire that represents God's presence passes between the halves. There again, you have some kind of a bilateral agreement, right? The whole question of what's going on in Genesis chapter 15, we could talk about another time. I'm not sure about that one. It's a little tricky one, but okay. Maybe the Brit Milah is easier to unpack. The Brit Milah, right? God promises Abraham progeny, descendants. Until that point, his only descendant has been Ishmael, who he thought was going to bear the future of his clan. And God says, no, I promise you a new child with your partner, your full covenantal partner in this promise, Sarah. I'm going to change your name. You now have a new name. Sarah has a new name. I'm making this promise to you. Well, you got to do something for me. You have to promise that each one of your male descendants is going to carry the same mark of the brit that you're going to carry. It's going to be tied into the organ of generation because the whole promise is about offspring and children, right? So again, the symbolism there makes sense. And it's, so to speak, cutting something where part is dedicated to God and part is retained by the other party of the brit, okay? We could think of other examples, right? When Yaakov and Lavan finally, after Lavan chases after Yaakov and encounters him at Gal'ed, at the, as Lavan calls it, Yegar Sehaduta, the mountains which are probably now either in the southwest of Syria or near the Golan Heights, somewhere there, right? And Lavan is chasing after Yaakov, threatening him, and they say, you know what, we'll make a deal. You're not going to come south of here. I'm not going to go north of there. We'll make a mound of stones that's going to be the boundary line, and we're going to share a sacrificial meal, a covenantal meal here. And Lavan invokes his ancestral gods, the god of Nahor, he says. And Yaakov said, I can't swear by the God of Nahor because I know Nahor was an idolater. I'll swear by the God of Abraham. So again, two parties each bearing witness to their God to help have them uphold their side of the deal. They're splitting the territory in half. Lavan says, I'm not going to come south of here. And Yaakov says, I'm not going to go north of here. Okay. And they share a meal on the mound. It says in the Torah, they actually sit on the mound of rocks and eat the animal. So again, if you think back, like, remember, the Torah is not Jews like we are now. The Torah, in Torah times, bronze was cutting edge technology, right? So, right, you know, Stone Age symbolism and Stone Age monuments and things we have to remember are fresh in their minds. Okay, so look at the Chizkuni letter Vav on the third page. The Chizkuni here is a 13th century, so he's a little bit later than Rashi. He's in France. And he's sort of a follow-up to Rashi in certain ways. He agrees with Rashi on some things. He disagrees with Rashi on some things. He builds off of some of his ideas. So Chizkuni says as follows, Hinei dam haberi, shenitchalek lishnei chatzaim, because the blood was divided into two portions. Shekain derech kortei brit, that's the way people who make a brit do things. They cut things in half. Shene'emar ha'egel asher karatu lishnaim vayavru bein betarav. Just like Yirmiyahu describes as well, when they're making a agreement there, you can look it up, that the sacrificial animal, again, is split in half, and sort of each party is responsible for one half. And so this seems to be taking the symbolism of the blood being split in half, not like Onkelos, but like Rashi. One is very, very literally. That is, half of the blood has to be dedicated to God. Now, how do you sprinkle blood on God? You can't, because God doesn't have a body. So you're going to sprinkle the blood on something that is representative or symbolic of God on the altar. And the other half has to be sprinkled on the people because they're party to the brit. They're being marked by a physical sign of having agreed to this covenant. So there's the na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to do it and we're going to listen to it, of buying into the Torah. But you need something else. You got to get wet, right? You got to get, Now, does anybody ever remember having heard anything about a physical marker of having entered into the brit at Sinai that something happened to afterwards? Oh, gosh. Did we do homework? I didn't even assign the homework yet. So how can you have done it? Okay. So.
Oh, no, it's the despair of, I have heard of this. Where did I hear of it? What context?
Yes. So, and it's a strange word that comes up. If you pay attention, when after the sin of the calf, the people are very upset, right? The people, of course, because God has said that God is going to withdraw God's presence from their midst, and they'll no longer escort them directly. Instead, they'll be led by an angel. This is Exodus chapter 34. Okay. And then near the end there, it says that people were crying. They were so upset. And Moshe had to remove the tent to the edge of the camp. And it says that even the people didn't put on Edyam, their testimonials. What? So Ibn Ezra there, and some of the other Mefarshim discuss this as well, say, oh, it was the clothing that they were wearing when they got sprinkled with the blood. How is that a testimonial?
Because it's recalling the experience of making that brit with Hashem.
Right. If the moment you said Na'aseh v'nishma, you got hit with a splatter of sacrificial blood, and that shirt you were wearing is now blood stained with the covenantal blood, I'm not washing that shirt. That's my special covenant shirt.
Right.
That's my special, I stood at Har Sinai and all I got was this lousy t-shirt shirt. Right. So, and that the people would not put on those shirts again after the sin of the golden calf because they were embarrassed that they had violated the covenant, and Moshe has to reassure them and whatever and promise them that the brit has been upheld, etc., etc. So that's interesting. That's saying the physical symbol of the sacrificial blood, that the blood-stained shirt is a crucial component of their having bought into receiving the Torah. So again, not something we usually talk about. Maybe it's a little bit arcane. Maybe it's a little bit gross and creepy here. But if we're thinking about this, again, if we try to put ourselves into the ancient mind and say, like, remember, blood is good mojo. Blood is a potent symbol of the animal's life force that gave its life to produce the sacrificial blood. It's a potent symbol of life in general. It's a powerful symbol, life and death, right? It's a symbol of God's power, human power to kill others. Right? There's so many different things that, of course, blood, why are we grossed out by blood? Because there's something more about right? The blood belongs on the inside, right? Like, I don't want to see. And in our modern times, of course, so few of us even, butcher our own meat, much less slaughter animals for meat, much less, right? How many of us deal with major injuries and wounds? My wife is a surgeon, so I see all the surgery textbooks open in the house, and then it's like, the kids are going to grow up with all sorts of, they'll be very desensitized to it, but I don't know if I'm getting desensitized, but anyway. Okay, so the idea of cutting something in half and taking the two halves, and half goes on each party, and then they're now bound by that, and they can use that as something to hold the other party accountable to the brit and say, I have a physical object that shows you made an agreement with me, you made a deal with me, right? Like when you sign your contract in triplicate and you have the yellow copy and you have the pink copy, right? So it's the same thing. God made a deal with me, right? What do we do with, the Torah is the text of the Brit, Sefer HaBrit, right? So where did the suzerain put the treaties? Remind me. Where were they deposited?
In his palace.
In the palace, in a temple. Well, for us, the palace and the temple are the same because our king is also our God, right? Until we get a human king, but that's whatever, right? At least at first, we have a human rule. We have an inhuman ruler. God is our direct ruler. So where's God's throne? Well, all of the later books of Tanakh always describe God as Yoshev HaKruvim. God is enthroned on the cherubim of the lid of the Aron. The Aron, the ark in the covenant, is, so to speak, God's throne. So God is seated on the throne. And where did the ancient kings put their treaties? Underneath the seat, in a box. What's the Aron that holds the luchot, that holds the Torah, that holds the text of the Brit? Luchot HaBrit, Aron HaBrit, right? Oh, it's the box for storing the covenant, because the covenant, the text of the Brit, is stored in the throne. Okay? But it's an empty throne because we can't make a physical image of a God with no physical image. Is this all working so far? Again, This is like little details here and there that I pieced together between academic stuff a little bit, from traditional commentaries a little bit, and right now we're unpacking Shemot Kaf Dalet. Let's take a look now. We have a few minutes left at the Midrash number Zayin. This is a Midrash that was recovered from a fragment in the Cairo Geniza, which was published by now I'm blanking on his name. Oh no, I'm so sorry. It's in the collection that was published, Midrash Tanaim. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the scholar who collated these midrashim. But this is at least an attempt to reconstruct the lost Midrash Mechilta on the book of Devarim from these fragmentary midrashim. So this is on page 57 of that Midrash collection. Now let's take a look. So it says Vaikach Moshe, but right now the Midrash is dealing with the pasuk back in Shemot, which we're studying now. So it just happens to be in a collection from Devarim, but it's this Midrash on Shemot. So it says as follows: Vaikach Moshe ad Hadama Yizrok al Ham. This is where this debate between Uncle Os and Rashi really got started. Okay, Moshe took the blood and threw it on the people. Al hamizbeach b'shem ha'am. He threw it on the altar in the people's name. Ata omer al hamizbeach b'shem ha'am or al ha'am kemashma'o. Do you take it to mean it figuratively, that it was on behalf of the people, or do you take it to mean it literally? Tilmod Lomar quotes the pasuk from Shemot in the end of Parashat Tetzaveh about the communal sacrifice that's offered daily, the Korban Tamid. Olat Tamid ledorotechem. It should be a continual sacrifice for all future generations. V'ne'emar, and when the communal sacrifice that's offered daily is repeated in the Parashat Pinchas, in the Torah reading that we read on Rosh Chodesh morning, the daily sacrifice as it appears there, it says as follows: Olat tamid ha'asuya behar Sinai. It's the communal sacrifice, continual sacrifice, which was performed at Mount Sinai. Those who heard the Rosh Chodesh Torah reading and wondered, like, oh, why does it have to tell me that? Like, that's a little bit of a strange detail. So this midrash is unpacking that detail. Says, well, what do you mean that it was offered at Mount Sinai? Oh, well, that was the sacrifice that we were just reading about. The Korban Olah that was offered at the foot of Mount Sinai when they received the Torah, according to the author of this midrash, is the same Korban Tamid that was offered every single day after that. The Korban Tamid, the daily sacrifice, which serves as the paradigm for the daily prayer, is actually perpetuating the initial sacrifice that was offered at the foot of Mount Sinai when they received the Torah. That is, every day. Why are we offering a sacrifice? Because we received the Torah. Because we're bound in perpetuity. It's like Groundhog Day. Every day is just reliving the day that we stood at Har Sinai. Maybe. That's another possibility, right? I like doing some fun stuff with chronology. Because again, if we get licensed to play with some of the, I played around with chronology in the Haggadah too. The Afikomen is the matzah we sent back in time from the end of the Seder back to the beginning. But we'll talk about that a different time. Okay. Pesach already passed. It's in the future. Okay. So what does it mean that that sacrifice was offered on Sinai? So Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Kish olat Sinai le olat Dorot. There's a connection, there's an argument by analogy between the sacrifice as was offered at Mount Sinai and the sacrifice which will be performed for all generations. Ma olat tamid al gabei hamizbeach, just like the daily communal sacrifice is offered on the altar. Af olat har Sinai al gabei hamizbeach. It must be that the sacrifice at Mount Sinai was offered purely on the altar. Like, don't get any ideas, Rashi. We're talking about a normal sacrifice, normal stuff. And that's our good friend Rabbi Akiva, who's usually pretty feisty with his midrashim. But okay. But in contrast to Rabbi Akiva, we get this other of the Tanaim. Abba Chanin Omer b'shem Rabbi Eliezer. Abba Chanin quotes Rabbi Eliezer, one of Rabbi Akiva's contemporaries, who says, Al ha'am kemashma'o, that the blood of the sacrifice was sprinkled on the people. So the main takeaway for today is number one. We explored Exodus chapter 24. We see that there's something going on here about the role of the sacrifice in binding the people to the covenant of accepting the Torah. There's something going on with the decision to offer a sacrifice, and in particular, something interesting with the Korban Olah, the burnt offering, something interesting with the Korban Shlamim, the peace or free will offering that's involved here. Notably, only on Shavuot do we offer a communal Korban Shlamim, and here at Matan Torah, at the time the Torah was given, there was a communal Korban Shlamim as well. Something interesting going on with the blood here, where there's this debate about whether the blood was sprinkled on the altar like a normal sacrifice, whether the blood was sprinkled on the people. What we're going to explore next week is how did the rabbis use these psukim and some of the concepts that were quoted tonight, like Ein Haza'ah, below Tefillah, the phrase Hartza'at Damim, some of these other concepts. How do the rabbis build up the halakhic framework that becomes the modern notion of conversion to Judaism? What are the halakhic components the rabbis extract through midrashic exegesis from these texts? Obviously, some of the ancient Near East stuff is not going to come into play as much next week. We'll take a look at two passages from the Talmud, one from Masechet Keritot, not so much studied, but very foundational to the topic of conversion, and one from Masechet Yevamot, which is really the core concepts of the conversion process as developed in the Talmud. So those two passages, we'll see some of the details there. We'll see what's considered to be indispensable components of the conversion process, what's considered to be a little bit dispensable and flexible depending on circumstance. How do the rabbis build a model of conversion that on the one hand takes into account all of the details of the passage we've just studied, and on the other hand is something that they can continue in perpetuity to allow halakhic conversion to Judaism, despite, of course, what is it that's the great rupture in Rabbinic Judaism is the loss of the temple. How is it that the cessation of the sacrificial service in the temple is going to impact the process of conversion, and how will the rabbis sort of rescue the process of conversion from being obliterated by the destruction of the temple? And what is that going to then, the third week, we'll add paraduma into the mix and see how that shapes everything. Okay. Any questions right now? I know some of this was arcane. Some of this was maybe things you have heard before, things you haven't heard before, things you've heard before but totally different, and lots of tangents. Yeah, Martha, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I do have a question. Is it significant that the Zevach Shlamim was offered? Because it apparently is traditionally brought by an individual. So is that
so I have theories behind this. Like I said, it's a little bit of a pet topic as well. I happen to have, I guess, the shlamim, communal shlamim, I don't have like a full handle on exactly. I have an idea about when the king gets the people to offer a communal shlamim, sort of. But yeah, it's a little bit still work in progress there. I'm not really sure.
But the rabbis didn't take that and build some of their ideas around conversion.
I don't think so. They're going to focus more on the korban olah for conversion. The convert is supposed to bring a korban olah, which we'll get into, and then how are they supposed to deal with the lack of the temple when there's no temple? How do you become a convert if you have to bring a korban? And they'll say, okay, we can get around. Like, as basically, I ruined next week's year. Okay. But yeah, so the shlamim piece I'm still thinking about. That'll be next year, I guess. We'll talk about the communal korban shlamim. That's one that Rabbi Zukir, when I mentioned Rabbi Zukir before, so I mentioned him my theory about korban shlamim, and he didn't like it so much. So it's still a work in progress.
So I don't know. If other people have questions, I'll hold this, but I have a comment more than a question. So when you're selling chametz, for instance, oftentimes the process is that if you're doing this with a rabbi, he hands you something, you hand it back. Is that also reminiscent of this whole procedure of making?
I never thought of it that way, but you're right. It had the reciprocity. What Martha is describing is usually called in the rabbinic literature either kinyan sudar, like purchasing something using an exchange of a scarf or handkerchiefs, or it's also called kinyan chalipin, like doing an exchange or a barter as a mark of acquisition. And there again, if you're thinking about sort of human behavior, how do you demonstrate that we're both parties to something, that we're both agreeing to something? We have to do some kind of exchange or some kind of reciprocal process. So there's definitely something there, though I do think that the details of a covenantal agreement is something more intense and more deliberate, and there are really specific symbols that are being evoked. If you look at Levinson's chapter where he discusses it, he gets into like 7 different steps in the Brit process that really are paralleled throughout, all of these different ancient treaties, and also in the end of Book of Vayikra and in the end of Book of Dvarim. So it becomes clear that sort of all of the different components of what's a Brit, the Torah is the record of a Brit between humanity or between the Israelite nation and God, and therefore it works in that way. Though, like you're saying, any business deal between two people in a certain regard, if it has a bilateral obligations, has certain components that are very similar to the Brit structure.
Right.
Okay. Kayla, big yesher koach, and thank you so much. And look forward to seeing everyone next week and continuing our learning together. And look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.